Just 2 months ago, the American electorate was all but certain that 2024 would be a sequel of 2020. President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump had cruised to their parties' respective nominations, though both candidates were seen as broadly unpopular. Whether it be the felony convictions against Donald Trump or the foreign policy debacles that have plagued the Biden administration, it was sure to be a close race between the lesser of two evils for the majority of Americans. And then the last month happened. With unprecedented event after unprecedented event occurring in quick succession, even Americans living under a rock have seen history unfold before their very eyes. Hello, I'm Alex Petrich, and welcome to a Met TV special report on the 2024 race for the White House. Today, our goal is to examine the timeline of the last month, which has been one of the most consequential in any American election cycle. My guest today is Dr. Robert Preuhs, chair of MSU's Political Science Department. Professor, thank you for coming on.
Well, thanks for having me.
So, we wanted to take this chronologically, where, as I mentioned, about 2 months ago, it seemed pretty stock that it was just going to be Biden versus Trump again. It was just going to be a rematch. And then we get this very early debate on CNN, uncharacteristically early.
Right. Yep. And the point of that, of course, was to quell some fears among Democratic supporters that maybe Joe Biden wasn't quite fit, right, for office. And so the strategy was, well, let's do it early and we'll take on Donald Trump and we'll be able to shore up some of that support. Didn't work out that way.
And I guess my main thing was, in March, he delivered the State of the Union and was widely lauded for his sort of conviction and coherency in the State of the Union. And then 3 months later, we see a very different President Biden on this debate stage. And was the State of the Union a fluke? Was the president's cognitive decline very quick? I guess my main thing is, why weren't alarm bells going off sooner for Democrats?
Yeah, well, you know, and I think in a lot of ways alarm bells had been going off. I mean, we did have a member of Congress from Minnesota trying to push on those kind of issues. Certainly a number of the electorate, you know, the non-committed voting during the primaries was driven in part or mostly by concerns about policy regarding Gaza and Israel. But you know, there were underlying kind of concerns, I think, within some Democratic circles going back. You know, that State of the Union, you know, the bar was set pretty low. He needed to come out and he needed to not screw up, really. You know, read off the teleprompter, and he did, and he gave a few interesting quips and fought back here and there. So yeah, I think part of that is perception, right? If the expectation is so low and you come out in a you know, it was a reasonable speech, but it wasn't one for the record books, you know, that I think helped. And so people started to say, okay, well maybe, right, more than anything, that this is gonna play out.
So the debate happens, and immediately the response from Democratic Party brass and from donors and from the general population is that Trump won the debate and that Biden came out looking pretty bad, which the thing was, like, Trump did not particularly look good either. I mean, they did like a fact check of everything he said during the debate, and so much of it was just factually incorrect.
Yeah.
But the debate happens, donors go haywire, and then over the course of the next week, we start to see Democratic lawmakers using that pass the torch rhetoric. But Biden stays on the campaign trail, touting his record, touting his legislative ability to get things done. Was that the right tone to strike? Was that ever going to sway back voters who had been turned off from the debate?
Yeah, and I don't, you know, that debate itself, I think, also is an issue of expectations, right? And so Donald Trump met his, and that was fine. No one worried about it. There were certainly higher expectations for Biden. I mean, he didn't meet him, and if anything, he sunk. So what do you do as a presidential candidate, right? Well, there's not much you can do. I mean, you can't go on television the next day and say, well, you're right, I'm not fit for office, and we're not fit for the campaign at least. So you have to kind of keep moving forward, and the way you do that is to state, I'm still ready to go on this campaign trail, and I'm still a fit leader. I don't think he had a whole lot of choice, and he was trying to figure out exactly where this momentum would go. I mean, it's one thing to have a few folks call for him to drop out of the race. It's quite another to have, you know, broad leadership taking that stance, and that didn't emerge so quickly after the debate. It started to trickle in, but I think he was waiting.
And that's what leads me into the next one. Among the lawmakers who had called for Biden to step aside were senators like Michael Bennet from Colorado, John Tester from Montana, Joe Manchin from West Virginia, and In the House, we had Brittany Pedersen from Colorado, as well as Adam Schiff from California. But there were some very notable omissions, I think, to those who, while things started to fester more over the course of the 2 weeks after the debate, we didn't get those remarks from either Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Right.
And obviously, Pelosi and Schumer had to toe the party line
Right.
and maintain unity. But what trends did you notice in those who did speak up and those who didn't?
Sure, and I think it's important to recognize that it's tough to be that first person to make that statement that my party's nominee should back out of this race, particularly at this stage of the game. So, who are these folks? Well, for the most part, they're kind of moderates, right, or seem to be moderates. Pedersen herself, Bennett certainly, and certainly not, from a Republican perspective, but I think in the big picture. So, you are kind of touting this line, thinking about and signaling about that independent, middle-of-the-road voter, right, and where is a Biden campaign going to lead for those folks? But you also have safe seats, right? Brittany Pedersen's not worried about losing her seat in the 7th. Bennett's not up. Manchin's, retiring for the most part. So I think that combination, you're not beholden to the president, you're not beholden to the money that might be part of the party's establishment right now. In terms of the folks that didn't, that really gets back to partly it's tough to be the one that's saying it. You don't want to get that wrong and be the one that pushes it back. But I think for the left, particularly Sanders and AOC, what they wanted to do is not be blamed if, right, say Biden continues, right? You then were one of the folks that said you should get out. That fractured the party, and if Biden loses, which was the anticipated result, you're blamed for it. I think the other part of that is a lot of folks, and I think we forget, are thinking about 2028. So if you're not blamed for it, then you can set the progressive wing up for a stronger argument. Not only do we play along, but this establishment, more moderate candidate lost dramatically. So we need to make a shift in that party, and that's been part of the argument they've been making for the last 8 to 10 years.
Moving on chronologically.
Sure.
So all that sort of calamitous stuff happens, and then on July 13th in Butler, Pennsylvania, Donald Trump narrowly escapes an assassination attempt.
Yep.
And I think so much of the discussion regarding the attempt on Donald Trump's life has centered around the hypothetical of had he been killed, or the analysis of how did the Secret Service screw up so bad. But we can think till we're blue in the face, like what if he had just been shot in the head like John F. Kennedy or something like that. But we live in a reality where he was grazed, and he got some very good PR for a few days, especially that image of him with the American flag with his fist raised, and that's been sort of co-opted by the GOP as a symbol of power.
Sure.
But I guess my whole thing is, Trump is one of the more controversial, if not the most controversial politician of the 21st century. And why now is my thing, because he was just as controversial in 2016, if not more vilified, because nobody knew just the extent of who he was as a leader. Why would it be that now somebody takes it into their hands to try and kill the president?
Right. Well, I guess there's a number of potential explanations. I think the big one is that, if the dark clouds are coming over, right, lightning's going to strike, you don't know exactly where it's going to strike, right? And I think that's kind of one of the things we have to remember about our political context is that, violence isn't so abnormal. Assassination attempts have occurred, and successful ones, if you add them up, in about 17, 18% of all people that have held the presidency, right? About 7 out of the 46. The other thing is, within the last 10, 15 years, we've seen a number of violent attacks. We have, the shooting of Gabby Giffords back in 2011 and 2017. You have the shooting at the congressional softball game. Mm-hmm. You have an attempt in 2011, again, also, I think it was 2011, against Barack Obama. You have, of course, the January 6th event. So you get a sense that something's going to happen. Predicting exactly when it's going to happen is tough. In this particular case, from the background, from what we know about the background of the would-be assassin, it sounds like this is an individual that was looking to shoot someone important, right, to find that attention. And I think you add to that clearly there was some issues with the local sheriff and local law enforcement and Secret Service, and maybe it's just testament to how good the Secret Service is leading up to a lot of these things that we don't hear about. My sense is that while we ought not expect every day to lead to an event of political violence, that the probability that it happens is much higher than we think it is, right? Because we're used to not having our president shot at least many generations are.
Sure. It has been 40 years since there was a serious attempt,
Right.
That being John Hinckley Jr. and Reagan in '81. But this decade, there have been, obviously, Shinzo Abe in 2022.
Right.
That was a successful assassination. And then I believe there was a member of parliament in England who was stabbed in 2021.
I think so too, right? So this stuff happens, and we expect it to happen actually more often in really polarized context, where we are right now. You add to that, high levels of intensity, and then you add to that, a really big nation with a lot of guns and individuals that have access to them, and one of those is probably interested or willing to do what they think is an important thing to do. And not to dismiss that by any means, but I think it's one of those elements that we need to, as a population, recognize that the rhetoric on both sides has really been such that inciting violence may be something that we ought to expect as opposed to be surprised by.
I think a follow-up to that would be, obviously, Donald Trump sort of, I don't want to say he fed into it, but it ended up, given how he escaped with his life with minor injuries.
Right.
Do you think it benefits him in a general election sense? Because there were a lot of people, I remember the day it happened, there were a lot of people saying, oh, Trump just won the election. And that may just be sort of a reactionary thing to say, like, oh, he looked so powerful by getting up and yelling fight at the crowd and stuff like that. But do you think genuinely this, the way he has spun this and the way that he did survive the attempt and turned it into sort of a, something powerful for his campaign, do you think it'll benefit him?
Well, it ought to have, right? You have, and again, we get back to that chronology, and you have Brittany Pedersen on the 13th saying, Biden should drop out, that kind of happening. The focus on Biden and the anticipation actually during that weekend that Biden might actually drop out that weekend, that pushes all of that off. Donald Trump has this narrow escape from, within an inch. It was remarkable. Comes up, the imaging is perfect, and then he has this opportunity, because you're following it up with the RNC, to have the whole nation in a week, essentially, of press time covering you. And I think he had a really big opportunity there, and this is why the expectation that the race might be over, although I think we're kind of getting to that point as political observers as well, that look, you now have the narrative of, particularly for your base, that a God, right, or whoever, right, helped you avoid this, being killed. You're now the chosen one, right? And the kicker that didn't happen, right? That follow-up messaging that didn't happen, particularly in his speech, but also kind of throughout the RNC, was that we need to tamp down our rhetoric. We need to come together as a nation. He had the opportunity to reach out to lots of folks that are very apprehensive, but very concerned about Biden and maybe not really content with the American economy and other kind of contexts. And it just didn't happen, right? Instead, you have maybe 15, 20 minutes of a recount in that big speech of the events and some lip service to, and of course the savior side, but nothing really following up. And then there was an hour of what was fairly traditional Trump stump speech, and that's fine, and maybe that should be expected. But I think that campaign really missed the opportunity to take advantage of what any other campaign I think would have really any other time would have really benefited that campaign.
There was also the address President Biden gave to the nation in the days after,
Right.
where he, his main phrase was to lower the temperature. I'm not sure truly what tone the president needed to strike, or if, what he needed to say in that. Do you think in any way that speech that Biden gave to the nation was in any way helping matters? Was it the tone he needed to strike? What did he need to say there?
I think actually he probably said what he needed to say, right? And he was being presidential, said we need to calm down. Violence is unacceptable. I mean, if you check all the boxes that you would say this is what he should be saying. I think the problem, at least from a campaign strategy perspective, is that he was still, in a lot of ways, Joe Biden in that Oval Office speech, and so it didn't come across as something that would help him in the candidacy. And I think the other side, in terms of context and just broad, small d democracy, everyone's seeing this thing, and we know we live in a polarized society, and we know you're saying what you need to say. And so, in terms of really swaying voters or really bringing more comfort to voters, I'm not sure that actually hit its mark. And a term I shouldn't be using, actually, right? But
yeah, of course. So within 48 hours of the attempt on Trump's life, the RNC begins, and he picks Mr. J.D. Vance from Ohio as his vice presidential running mate. It's a controversial pick by many. He's the first millennial on a major party ticket. He's very fresh. He only took office in the Senate last year. Why him over other names that were in that running, like Tim Scott or Doug Burgum? Was it a smart pick? It seems like a bit of a gamble on his end.
Yeah, I mean, so when you're picking vice presidential candidates, you're doing usually two things, right? One, you want to find geographically someone that can influence a swing state, and then two, some background that can kind of offset whatever the candidate's background is, right? To try to broaden that appeal. So what does J.D. Vance bring to that? I think the biggest thing is you look at the map, right? And from Ohio and his ability to discuss issues that resonate with Rust Belt voters, and the reality that Joe Biden and the Biden campaign really needed to pick up, they have to pick up Pennsylvania, or at least did, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. If they lose any one of those, Trump wins. And so it's not a bad gamble to pick someone from Ohio. I think in terms of background, you've got a younger face. Certainly a lot of the discussion at the campaigns at the point was, we've got a 76, 78-year-old and a 81-year-old running. Someone younger will help. That said, there's concerns, right? There's plenty of video footage out there for Vance criticizing Trump, and that's certainly, we're going to see a lot of that going forward. And he's relatively unknown, but at the same time, I think he has a personality that can resonate certainly with his base. And a lot of the issues that he's been concerned about recently, at least, have been focused on those Rust Belt voters. So, on balance, I think it's probably a wise decision. Were there better? I'm not so sure Burgum would have been, or a Tim Scott would have been, but there may have been others. But, Trump picks his candidates and his friends and his enemies in ways sometimes that deviate, but I think you can see some of those underlying structural, typical decision points in that choice.
There has been, and of course we'll get to later in the discussion, the sort of, Biden dropping out, obviously, and sort of Trump thinking with the polling numbers and the drying up of Democratic donations that ultimately led to Biden withdrawing from the race, that Kamala Harris will be a greater threat, and that the pick of J.D. Vance seems like less of a shoo-in because he thought he was playing with house money at that point because Biden's so old and stuff. Do you think Trump should be second-guessing Vance at this point?
I don't know. There's always buyer's remorse at some point, and there's no way in this particular election to spend too much time doing it because we'll never know what's going to happen next week. But no, I think he kind of likes J.D. Vance. He does have that kind of populist appeal. He's smart. He's able to explain policies, I think, to voters in more detail than President Trump is used to doing. So I think, and still as a surrogate, it's not a bad choice. And I honestly I can't think of other ones that really would be that much better. And for the most part, keep in mind that voters still vote for the top of the ticket. They vote for the president, and vice presidents can can sink a campaign. Certainly John McCain's campaign thought that with Sarah Palin pick. But this one's ideologically and in terms of the ability to talk to the media and talk to voters, I don't think this is one that's going to sink Trump's prospects.
Dan Quayle, he is not.
He is no Dan Quayle.
So I guess next would be, so 25 million people watched Trump's RNC acceptance speech, which we went over earlier about
Sure.
if he struck the right tone or not,
Yeah.
or if he, gave enough lip service to his assassination attempt, and if he was just treating it as any other casual
Right.
campaign stop. But after Trump's speech, it took 3 days for Joe Biden to resign from the Democratic nomination for president. Obviously, the COVID diagnosis that he had played a crucial role in that. It just,
Right.
There's that image of him very weakly getting onto Air Force One after his diagnosis and all that. But, there were so many moving factors in those last few days of Joe Biden, the candidate, that I think really led to that culmination last weekend. But what was it that ultimately did him in? Because we could talk about what did him in 4 years ago,
Right.
But what in those last few days, what do you think the final nail in the coffin was?
And I think actually thinking again about timelines, that weekend where Trump's assassination attempt occurred, I think that was where a lot of folks anticipated that Biden would be making the decision to get out, and within the first couple of days that he would have done that. And part of that is just strategic, right? I mean, you have a RNC coming up. If you can switch, you have news focus that moves folks away from the RNC, and you can kind of pick that up. But once that assassination attempt occurs, then you as a president probably need to remain the presidential nominee. You don't want to add more instability to the system. But that elongated the amount of time that this kind of question could ferment within the Democrats and Democratic leadership. And I think we just saw, this kind of snowball. And so, what is it? Well, I mean, once you get to even your best friends, the closest allies, Pelosi making hints about you should be getting out, Schumer suggesting something but not really endorsing it, right? And the donors drying up. Bill Clinton saying it's time, Barack Obama saying it's time but not endorsing. And so these kinds of things just add up. And I think that extension of the extra week, right, made it that much more apparent to Biden himself, right? He got a little bit of reprieve, but the reprieve wasn't really in terms of this mounting discontent within the party. The reprieve was just time, right? That you didn't have to make the decision. Mm-hmm. But we can speculate. I don't know. I mean, I think the bottom line is that COVID in an 81-year-old is often not a good thing, and I think that just underscored this apprehension among the public, and I think that then allowed for folks that were pushing for Biden to drop out to really make even a stronger case, right? I mean, you still have to be the president, and that just didn't seem like that was happening.
And there's also sort of compounding on that. Looking through the history of Biden's popularity numbers, obviously when he took office in 2021, I think the American people were willing to give him a chance just because we had been through this national nightmare that was 2020 with COVID and racial unrest and a sinking economy and stuff. But throughout the Biden administration, obviously he's had legislative victory in his time, whether it be the Inflation Reduction Act or the infrastructure bill, sure, the bipartisan infrastructure bill. It's been a mixed bag presidency, as I think it is for all. But I think really, if you look at the polling numbers, at least according to 538, which is just an aggregate of several polls, it was really around the withdrawal of Afghanistan that Biden's disapproval ratings, there was that intersection. Right. And outside of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, we've had the war in Ukraine, the conflict in Israel and Gaza, and of course there was that large part halfway through his presidency with inflation and stuff like that. And his approval ratings have hung around like high 30s, low 40s since that point. Do you think in a general election he ever really stood a chance given how his first term played out due to factors that were also outside of his control?
Right, and I think, yeah, and traditionally what we see is a bump up, right? Kind of that victory boost, and then kind of dribbling down. And if you look back in the really long spectrum, that those approval ratings of presidents tend to ebb and flow with the economy first and foremost. But we've disconnected that over the last several presidential administrations, right? And so we're so polarized that Democrats aren't moving, Republicans hate them, Democrats love them, and you can switch that depending on the party of the president. So if you step back, those polling numbers don't look all that much different than what you might expect, and don't look that much different, say, than Trump. So to attribute it to just Afghanistan, for instance, and I don't think you are, but to attribute it just to Afghanistan, that was one of many compounding factors.
Yeah.
I think that discontent just continued to be present. And I think Joe Biden, just partly in terms of age and partly in terms of his ability to deliver, just that compelling argument about what they've done, just didn't resonate as well with particularly with independents, right? And those are the folks that are moving those numbers. That said, the ceiling now is generally 40-45% for approval ratings, and that's been the case through Obama. So maybe he wasn't so far behind the gun, but all that said, it didn't look good, right? I mean, the odds from a macro perspective for a president with a 38-40% approval rating aren't good in the general election. And the only saving grace, frankly, was that Trump was his opponent, and his approval ratings are about that low as well.
Yeah. So, of course, Joe Biden resigns from the nomination and endorses Kamala Harris, and a lot of the Democratic Party brass over the last couple of days has done the same. Mm-hmm. But she's the presumptive nominee heading into the DNC. Now, as vice president, she has somewhat been in the background, I would say. But now that she is drumming up this support, and we've seen fundraising numbers skyrocket for the Democrats in that point. She just held a rally in Wisconsin, of all places, which is a very shrewd move. How should she separate herself from Joe Biden? Should she market herself as Biden 2.0, or how can she stake her own claim as a candidate for the presidency?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the criticisms of the Biden campaign really was the inability to provide this sense of what's their plan for the next 4 years. Vice presidents are never going to be able to distance themselves completely from the president they served at, particularly if it's so proximate. So I think that what she needs to do really is to come up, one, with a plan, because voters want to know what that vision looks like, and as best you can, draw on, and this is what she'll do: draw on and highlight some of those victories, right? But then also move forward with, this is my vision, right, for the country for the next 4 years. I think that's really important. But in that ability to distance herself from what was an unpopular administration and candidate, she does have some built-in benefits too. I mean, just her background, demographics, age, right, her racial and ethnic background, her story from California. Also, all of those kind of things, free her a little bit from what I think voters have of this image of Joe Biden, which is just an older gentleman that served his country, but it's time to be done serving the country.
She was a candidate in 2020,
right,
and did not get very far in the Democratic process for their nominee. And of course, we widely attribute her downfall to, I think it was the second debate when Tulsi Gabbard went after her for her record as Attorney General.
Right.
But she was a fairly progressive senator in her time before she was tapped to be VP. Right. But the American people during the Democratic nomination process, they were sort of anchoring themselves behind other candidates instead of her. Do you think that will at all rear its head in this, or has she, through serving as vice president, staked enough of a claim and enough of an identity?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the Democratic Party, they're hopeful that they have a different candidate, and they're clearly aligning, and the endorsements and the backing and the fact that she can amass the number of delegates that she's amassed it already signal to me it's going to be a pretty unified Democratic coalition. How those kind of things then play out in those moderate votes, those middle voters, Yeah, I think actually, times have changed enough. One is she's got another 4 years, and she actually didn't make it to 2020. She dropped out at the end of 2019. That, one, voters have an appetite for a little bit more law and order. There's a little bit more uncertainty there. I don't think, being a prosecutor is going to be a problem for among the general electorate. It was in 2020, because you got to remember there was also a progressive, more establishment battle in 2016 that the progressives lost. In terms of kind of other elements, she doesn't have great approval ratings, right? She's still underwater in that, but then again, so is Trump. And so how she can go forward with that in the nominee, I think she probably would have a tougher time in a full-blown nomination process than she's had now, but Democrats are rallying, and I don't see much defection in that.
Moving on. Yes. How worried should Republicans be of Kamala Harris in a general election setting, and how dependent is her path to the presidency on her vice presidential pick?
Right. So let me start with the second one first. Again, it gets back to the same kind of calculus that Donald Trump's worried about. Which states are close, and there's, several that are really key. Again, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. At the time of Biden being still in the race, Democrats had to win all 3 of those, right? If Trump won 1, they would lose. But she opens up a few other opportunities. There's possibilities now, maybe in Georgia, maybe in North Carolina, it'd be a stretch. But what you're trying to do now is think about, okay, for a vice president, which state is going to help me out, or is there a candidate from one of the states that's going to help me out? And then 2, are there some ideological or background balancing that can occur? And I think the reality of this, of a Harris run is that we're still going to see some racialized voting patterns, right? We saw that heightened during the Obama administration. We did not end a racialized political context then. If anything, it kind of separated folks a bit more. And so we're going to still see some of that. There's still some gender issues. So my guess is she's going to probably find a white male in order to kind of balance some of that issue. And then what you want to look for is a state that's going to help you out. And so the governor of Pennsylvania has been talked about. That would probably be a pretty good one. Kelly down in Arizona, which they were losing but could be opened up, might help that as well. And then there's a few others like Roy Cooper out of North Carolina that would open up North Carolina and Georgia. So those kind of balancing things are things that all candidates think about, and that's probably what they're thinking about now. So should the Trump campaign be worried no matter what? Well, it resets the election, I think. You no longer have this target in Joe Biden. You certainly do have plenty of things to talk about. You're going to try to tie Harris to the Biden administration and all the discontent there, particularly in terms of immigration, in terms of inflation, affordable housing, all those big factors that a lot of voters consider. But there's the same attacks that they've made against Harris through her vice presidency, again focusing on immigration, but then going back, right? Records as a San Francisco liberal, right? And I think those are kind of things that they'll tie to her. They may not be as successful because she does have this prosecutorial background, and certainly she's framing this election, or at least those are the early hints, as I'm a prosecutor, he's a felon, right? And you can make that choice.
I think, so in sort of the chronology of the events that we've discussed, there's just been so much talk about how we are living through unprecedented or historical times, and how all of these things that we are discussing will be taught in history books in 50
Right.
years. But it's easy to play into just that recency bias. And of course, these are unprecedented things that we're
Right.
living through,
Yep.
but there are some things that are going to be lost to time, I guess. And when we look back on this, as is sort of our goal, as both I as a journalist, you as a professor, but also as historians of politics, there have been so many events that have happened in the past 4 weeks that were just like, wow, I can't believe this happened. It's so,
Right.
What do you think will actually be remembered
Right.
when the time comes.
Yeah, and I think the point's well taken too. I mean, I used to show slides to my students, and every 10 of these statements about how this is the most important election of our time, and then it's just, it's every election. But this one is different, and I think that we want to, part of it depends on the outcome of the election, right? I mean, if Harris ends up winning this election in November, we have the first female, right, and first African-American female and first Asian-American female. That's a big deal in a very diverse country that's still struggling with diversity. Will it solve all of our problems in terms of racial ethnic conflict? Not at all, but that's a big deal. We'll learn about that. I think the other aspect is that we will probably talk about a president, again, if she wins, President Biden that withdrew from an election. That doesn't happen very often, and so. Those types of elements. In terms of fundamental shifts in public policy, probably not. Again, with a Harris win. If Trump wins, right, then maybe we hear a little bit more about the rise of the populist movement, or a rebirth of the populist movement about 100 years after its previous kind of push. And we may, depending on where we go, look at that as a turning point in terms of where we fall on this democracy spectrum. Again, we have a system of institutions that do tend to kind of forestall some rapid movements, checks and balances, all the usual American government 101 stuff. It's not perfect. We certainly seen some shifts in that, depending on personalities that hold, say, seats on the Supreme Court. But it has held, and it may be teetering a little bit. I'm hopeful that it'll hold again. But at the same time, I think it's really going to depend on the outcome of this race, right? If it's a close race and there's no insurrection again, depending on who wins, we may see slightly different narratives come out of that.
I think then my final question would be, and of course it is still July.
It is July.
But as she is the presumptive nominee, and depending on who she picks as
Right.
her VP, I'll ask both sides of the coin. What does Kamala Harris need to do to become the next president of the United States?
Okay, so one thing she already has going for her, she's kind of has this re-energized base, which Joe Biden didn't have. So that's going to help in terms of those things. I think one of her criticisms of her is her inability to really provide clear and concise descriptions of policy, right? So to be able to speak to everyday people about what is going on or what their plans are, and then that is another element of this broader message of what will the United States look like for 4 years under a Harris presidency. So I think those are pretty big ones, and then tactically you focus on the states that matter. And again, for her demographic, Democrats in particular are mobilizing, particular demographics. I think, places like Milwaukee and Detroit and Philadelphia turnout are going to be really important. So I think those are the things you're going to focus on. And maybe broadening the battleground, because those would be the three. If you can bring in Georgia into play, if you can bring Arizona into play, that changes some of the dynamics. And so I think that's the big picture. I mean, and don't screw up, right? And don't screw up with your vice presidential choice either.
Sure. And then what does Donald Trump need to do to become president again?
Right. And so Donald Trump's broke all the rules, not all of them, many of the rules in terms of winning this candidacy. The thing about the Republican nominee, and Trump in particular in this case, is that you don't need to win the national popular vote, right? You need to win the electoral college vote, and then that really means these particular states that you need to focus on. He needs to stick on his message, right? Immigration does resonate with his base. They're very concerned, and that concern has spread to folks in suburbia, which ultimately make decisions or ultimately have the influence. They're the ones that can go back and forth. There are things that folks on the right or the left might like to see him say more of, but I don't anticipate shifting that too much. And as I said, what if I was a consultant and I was telling him during that RNC speech he didn't follow that, I don't think he's going to shift it anyway. So I think the idea is that, we've done well enough so far. We've won 50% of them. We can continue to do this, and what we need actually is a bit better maybe ground game and organizational, and I think they have that this year. So ultimately it's still going to be a really close race. I don't see that shifting either way. The big strategies are still going to be there, but the messaging and who you turn out and your ability to do that is really going to be what's changed over the last couple of weeks.
Professor, it's been a pleasure.
Pleasure, always.
Thank you for joining us today for our discussion. For more content covering local, state, and national politics, please check out the Met Report and Met TV YouTube channels linked in the description, and stay tuned for more political content as election season continues.